So just give people a moment to come in. It takes a wee while actually. Oh, great. So welcome to those who are arriving in our webinar today. We're just going to give people a few moments to come into the room. I can see more people coming in there. Great. So welcome everyone. Welcome those who are arriving in our webinar. I'm Ali, your host for the session, and we're just going to take a few minutes for everyone to arrive so you can feel that you are now connected, if you can see and hear me, and if not, do send a message in the chat and I'll try to help. And we'll just give some time for everyone to come in. Great, nice to see everyone here. It's exciting to see everyone from so many different geographies and all with a connection to what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so I can see that we're on the hour at the moment. I think what I'm going to do is just give it a couple more minutes just to see if there are others who want to come in. And once that's happened, I will be just sharing a few practical remarks about being here in our online gathering today, which I'm sure we're all getting very familiar with. But nonetheless, I'll just say something as we arrive, and then hand over to our leader of the session and our panel to get us started. So welcome. I can see more people arriving in our webinar this afternoon. I'm Ali, your host of the session, and we're just going to take another minute or so for people to come in before we formally start. So if you're in and you can see and hear me, then that's very good. You're all set up. Stay with us, and we'll be starting very shortly. I'm in the privileged position of seeing people coming in the online door, arriving in the webinar, which is nice. So yeah, just give it another minute or so and then share a few remarks on how we can be here in the session today. Okay, so I think I might just kick off with some things that I was going to say myself before we formally start. So for all of you who are here with us already, I'd just like to just say just a simple thing about how we wanted to be here and kind of attend and be part of the webinar this afternoon. So if I could just draw your attention, the main function we'd like to invite you to use is the chat, the famous chat, and you should see that option in the bottom toolbar, the black toolbar of your screen. And I just want to kind of highlight one thing. If you click on that chat button, it should bring up a box like this, and you'll see this blue button here is actually just set to the panelists, which are the key speakers in the event today. But we'd actually really love if you have questions, comments, remarks, things that are coming up for you, you might want to share those with the whole group, and then we can all be part of the conversation together. So when you want to share those, if you click on that blue button and actually select the second option, which is panelists and attendees, and then type in your comment, that way it will be seen by everyone. So that's just a little reminder there. It's easy not to do that. So just invite you to do that. And in fact, even if you want to do that now to say hello or introduce yourself, announce yourself in the room, you're welcome. You don't have to. Give a test out of the chat function in this session, then please do. And then I think the only other thing I need to say on the practical side is that we are going to be recording the webinar and all the key speeches and presentations so that you could have that as a reference. We can share that more widely with colleagues. So just for you to know that that's going to be happening as well. So with that, I think I'm going to, I'll maybe stop sharing the presentation here and bring up our leader for the session. And with that, I'd say we are ready to start.
Great. Thank you, Ali, and welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to be at this point and all set for hopefully a good exchange of ideas and thoughts in relation to the model emergency housing legislation and how it can be used to protect the right to housing during COVID. My name is Cecilia Forrestal and I work for a social justice NGO. We're based here in Dublin called Community Action Network. We're known as Can Do. Our work is quite varied, but essentially it's all about placing people at the heart of change. And of relevance, I suppose, to this webinar is that we have been facilitating rights holder-led campaigns for local authority house tenants and for people at risk of losing their homes due to mortgage distress. So that's our connection into rights-based approach to housing. I'm a member of the steering group that has prepared this model emergency legislation, and I'm very happy to be facilitating the session. This is our first capacity building webinar where we're hoping to explore how this model legislation can be used to protect housing during the COVID pandemic, but also during the resulting economic crisis. We're very grateful to Fianza and Housing Rights Watch, who are also members of the steering group, for organizing this particular session, which may have people from other countries, but essentially has a European focus. But we'd like to let you know that this is the first of 3 and that we hope there will be at least another 2, one with a Latin American focus and one with an African focus, to be organized by The Shift, who are also members of the steering group in due course. So now I would like to just take you through our agenda for the session, and as I do, to introduce you to some of the key members of the steering group who are going to be our speakers today. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Marguerite Angeleri, who is a senior legal officer with the Open Society Justice Initiative, where she leads a project on economic justice. Marguerite will share with us why and how this emergency model legislation came about. We will then hear from Pádraig Kenna, who is a senior lecturer in law in NUI Galway in Ireland, and Pádraig will take us through the main features of the legislation. Leilani Farha, former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing and Global Director of The Shift, will highlight ways in which governments and legislators can use it. And then finally, Maria Aldanas, Policy Officer with Fianza, will outline ways in which advocacy groups and NGOs can use it. And then we'll have the opportunity for an exchange through the chat, as Ali has highlighted. And feel free to pose questions for the panel, and we'll try and take them in turn as we go ahead. So let's begin. So I suppose as we gather here and sit together from different countries and contexts, we're united in our awareness of how COVID has amplified a very pre-existing crisis in housing. And yet the major global response has been to stay at home and wash your hands. So health and well-being and protecting the collective good have become the dominant priorities. Home is perceived as a place of safety from which the population can do its part to keep us all healthy. And yet, globally, we know that home is not a place of safety for every person. Those without homes, living in temporary shelters, direct provision, halting sites, residential settings, renting in damp, moldy, overcrowded houses and apartments, within unstable communities, living in the shadow of repossession or the fear of mortgage default, have a very different experience to those who have an adequate dwelling within healthy environments and stable communities. So I'm going to hand over to Marguerite now, who will say more about this context and why and how the steering group came together to develop this model legislation. Marguerite is a senior legal officer with the Open Society Justice Initiative, where she leads a project on economic justice. She has practiced law in Washington, DC, Baltimore, and Chicago, and also served as the Godert Professor of Elder Law at Loyola University, Chicago for 9 years before joining the Justice Initiative. So over to you, Marguerite.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I wish I could see all of you out there, but I know you're there from the little number at the bottom of the screen, so welcome. This Model Emergency Housing Act developed out of a body of work on the right to housing that the Open Society Foundations began engaging in about 2015. This work included support for efforts to ensure better rental housing, better rental housing conditions and policies in Europe, and also strategic litigation and advocacy to promote the use of European human rights law in mortgage foreclosure cases. And then COVID hit, the COVID pandemic hit, and made the need to enforce the right to housing all the more urgent. People were directed to stay at home. At the same time, many people lost the means for paying for their homes. People in precarious living situations or without housing at all are obviously particularly susceptible to the virus, yet public health concerns were used by public health authorities in some cases as a pretext for forcibly evicting people from temporary settlements. Some states passed emergency legislation, emergency relief efforts, but some did nothing. And even with these emergency protections, our research found that evictions were still taking place in most parts of the world. And the protections passed by states were incomplete. Distinctions were made between types of housing that made little sense. For some, in some cases, governments barred evictions from rental housing while doing nothing to protect people in mortgaged housing, or vice versa. Some state measures simply prevented evictions, but were simply voluntary and couldn't be enforced in any way. And in most states, people in informal and temporary settlements, migrant and refugee housing, people with disabilities, those facing homelessness were left without any specific protection. Lastly, most of the measures passed during the first wave of the pandemic were scheduled to end in a matter of months. Now, many of these have been extended, but there's still this piecemeal approach and emergency, again, protecting some groups and not protecting other groups, protecting some kinds of housing and not other kinds of housing. And as far as we can find, none of these measures provide for protection during the economic crisis that we know is going to follow the COVID-19 pandemic. So recognizing the need for a comprehensive approach to protect the right to housing at this critical time, we formed a steering committee and drafted this legislation, which we'll be talking about today, this model legislation. The steering committee included representatives from FEANSA, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Community Action Network based in Dublin, SEAPI in Argentina, The Shift, founded by Leilani Farha, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, and the National University of Ireland Galway Centre for Housing Law, Rights and Policy. We were a diverse group, and as you can imagine, we had some heated discussions, but we're still talking to each other. And I think that our end product was stronger because of that. Our aim was to provide activists and lawmakers with sample legal provisions that could be used to ensure the right to housing during the pandemic. And again, the economic crisis following it, because we do think that's critical. We based this draft model on actual emergency housing legislation that we found. We also looked at submissions from civil society and community groups to the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, and also the resulting reports and recommendations by the Special Rapporteur. And lastly, our individual experiences working with affected communities in various parts of the world. While we combine provisions from various sources, various existing legislative measures, we do go beyond what we saw in existing legislation by including provisions to protect people in all kinds of housing, those facing homelessness, people living in temporary encampments and housing for migrants. This act also includes detailed provisions to ensure its enforceability and goes farther than what we've seen in other instances. We think, though, the pandemic is an unprecedented event that has made the impossible possible. It's our hope that this model act will serve as a catalyst for comprehensive legislation to ensure the right to housing is at this critical time and beyond. We see this as an opportunity to lay the groundwork for a future where the right to housing is enshrined in law. And it is gratifying that there's so much interest in this legislation. I look forward to these presentations and especially the discussion at this very first webinar. And on that, I'll pass the baton to our next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Marguerite. And I just want to point out that Marguerite herself was the driving force behind getting this initiative up and running. And without her passion and commitment and energy, we'd never have gotten off the ground. So that was one thing you didn't say, but I feel the need to say. So thank you for that. Okay, so we're just going to continue on and hand over now to Pádraig. Pádraig Kenna is probably well known to many of you in this conversation, but he's a senior lecturer at law in NUI Galway in Ireland. He's a researcher, a writer, and an advocate on housing rights, and well recognized within the international context for all of the same. He's also a founding member of Fianza's Housing Rights Expert Group and has worked with Open Society Justice Initiative for a number of years on economic justice and housing rights. He has written and advocated housing legislation in Ireland, and that was very successful, and was involved in drafting this model legislation. So Pádraig now is going to take us through the main features of the legislation itself. And Pádraig, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Cecilia. And thank you all for attending this very interesting webinar, where we're hoping that at the end of it, you will come away with something useful that will be useful for legislators and for advocates. Now, of course, I'm an academic, so the only way we can operate, as you know, is with PowerPoints. So I'm going to share the main features of this of legislation through the slides. And I promise not to take too long. So this model legislation then is the result of a group effort, a steering group effort, lots of discussions. We called it Model Emergency Housing Legislation, Protecting the Right to Housing During COVID. Now, it's actually a bit more than that, because it's inspired largely from the guidelines produced by the Leilani while she was UN Special Rapporteur early in 2020 on a whole range of topics: rented accommodation, mortgage, informal settlements, homelessness. It actually inspired us to say, yes, this is really valuable. We can build on this, but we also wanted to look at something else: the duration of the crisis. Now, the pandemic, of course, has economic consequences, social and economic consequences, which are both immediate and longer term. And the longer term ones include arrears of rent and mortgage, insecurity. And so we wanted to deal with that at two levels. And the first one is to have effective measures from which are immediate, also for the duration of the pandemic. We're not sure how long it's actually going to happen, but also to deal with the economic consequences. And how do we know when that ends? Well, we're using a guideline really as when governments no longer provide supports to any natural or legal persons, including companies, of course, who benefit enormously from the various supports, whichever occurs the later. And so that might well be a number of years from now. So I'm going to very quickly now go through the provisions of the legislation. Probably the most striking is Section 1, which says that evictions should be or must be prohibited for the duration of this act, and that is until the end of this pandemic and its economic consequences. And we have a couple of exceptions for violence, etc. But any attempts to serve a notice of eviction would be automatically void. No tribunal hearing or courts should take place about evictions in this period of time. And the other measure, which we've taken from a lot of different countries around the world and different pieces of legislation, is a rent freeze during the act, for the duration of the legislation. We want a rent freeze. That is a rent increase freeze, no increase in rents. But equally, we want no rental agreements, formal or informal, to be cancelled. And even more important, we don't want any fees to be charged for arrears of rent or mortgage, which have accrued as a result of unemployment or illness or other reason during the pandemic. And then we're proposing something that's not quite new, but some people may not have heard it. We are saying there should be a cap on total housing costs, including any arrears repayments, either mortgage or rent, at 30% of the net household disposable income. And this is becoming an accepted standard around the world. Debt relief programs must prioritize security of tenure. And we're also promoting this principle of datio in salutem, where those with mortgages should be allowed to redeem the mortgage by returning the property if they so wish. We, of course, are very concerned that sanitation, adequate sanitation and cleaning products must be provided in all types of accommodation. Equally, essential services, water, electricity, heating, and communication must not be suspended due to informality, that is, no agreements or non-payment or COVID-related reasons. And then particularly focusing on the United Kingdom, we have a section which says that providing housing support or renting to people who are migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees must be allowed, rather than this right to rent provision, which happens in the UK and some other countries. This is a very important time for people who live in precarious situations. We're also proposing here that public housing assets, including public land, will not be sold for the duration of this Act, which is including the duration of all supports, and that there should be immediate steps to expand public housing. In this light, governments should have a preemptive right to purchase housing available on the market to further this Act, including the purchase of commercial buildings, which may be converted into emergency accommodation or long-term housing. In terms of homelessness, we are proposing in this legislation, and this is a measure that many countries have already taken on board, but we want to see this in a comprehensive way. Immediate access to safe, secure, and dignified emergency accommodation to be guaranteed to anyone who is homeless without discrimination on any ground. And then for those who are in temporary emergency accommodation, not to be evicted without adequate alternative housing being provided, but equally that this be used as a basis for long-term secure housing with adequate supports, supported housing where necessary. We're also conscious that the housing pandemic is having impact at lots of levels in the housing systems. And we are aware that in some cases, small landlords of one or two properties, may also be experiencing financial difficulties, which of course may lead to great difficulties for tenants. So we're suggesting where possible that emergency financial assistance be considered for landlords who offer reduced rents. This is small landlords, and so we are really not recommending that any of this be extended to real estate investment trusts or corporate landlords, especially not companies with offshore accounts, especially companies with accounts in designated tax havens. And any support to investors or developers must be conditional on the provision of social housing in any development at a level proportionate to local needs. In terms of implementation, we have designated the national housing minister of each country to be the responsible person. Of course, it may well involve regional government, regional responsibility, but the designated responsible person is the national housing minister. There must be access to effective legal remedies for those who are intended to benefit from this legislation. And to that end, we're proposing an emergency housing tribunal be established to hear complaints about breaches of this legislation, but also that this legislation could well be used as a defense to eviction proceedings. We're proposing that costs, fines, reinstatement of those who are evicted, and criminal sanctions in some cases be put in place as part of the legislation, and that monitoring, which is essential, monthly public statements of progress to be presented to the legislature. This is really a public monitoring system. So with all of that, we're saying that we want to see comprehensive legislation addressing the right to housing on the basis of COVID-19. But in any case, we're able to point now to some places, some instances which have been seen impossible in the past, but now are possible. In fact, rent freeze, moratoria on evictions, we were told were impossible for many reasons. Now we see that many states have emergency measures, some of which may well overlap with measures on the right to housing. So the question we have is this a possibility to glimpse the future, that we can have this kind of legislation, comprehensive, with the right to housing, or is this going to be a mere aberration, a very short-sighted mirage? Can we build comprehensive housing rights into our legislative response to COVID-19? And so I want to thank all the people who were involved in drafting this. It was really a great experience, and I hope we have produced something that's useful to all of you out there, housing rights advocates, legislators, NGOs, which will be useful to you. Please come back to us for more information. And there I end.
Thank you, Pádraig. I suppose drafting this legislation, as you can see, was a very ambitious project. Not only is it global and relates to many different contexts and systems, but it addresses the rights of people living in very different situations. And I just want to point out that Pádraig was responsible for the first and subsequent drafts and for drawing attention to the key questions and challenges in a way that made it a lot easier for all the rest of us to engage with and contribute. So I wouldn't underestimate the ease with which you did that. So thank you. I'm going to now introduce, and I don't need to introduce, I'm sure, Liane Farah, who's probably well known to everybody in this conversation. Liane is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing and currently the Global Director of the Shift. Her work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity. Liane has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including through her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, and rights-based housing strategies. And she's responsible for the first UN guidelines for the implementation on the right to housing, which were very much the foundation for this legislation and very much informed the direction in which it developed and moved. Liane is now going to talk to us and explore how legislators and governments can use it. So thank you, Liane.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. And I'm going to just start by apologizing to everyone that I have to leave early as I'm taking my elderly father for his first jab vaccination against COVID-19. So my apologies that I will slip out early. I want to say I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. When Marguerite approached me and suggested that I engage in this model legislation, I was thrilled and daunted. I was daunted because of the scope, and you can see the amount of work that must have gone into this thing. It's very distilled, and Pádraig gave such a brilliant overview. Thank you, Pádraig. We will just be using your overview over and over again because it was so perfect. So yeah, daunted because of its scope, but thrilled at the idea that there were enough of us around the world who agreed this was an essential issue that needed to be tackled on an urgent and priority basis. And so I was just so pleased to participate. I just have to say that. And we did have really heated debates about a variety of aspects. And it was really so intellectually invigorating, and really invigorating for me, having just emerged out of the rapporteurship into a world where I'm really hell-bent on implementing and helping governments to implement the right to housing. And so for me, as heated as the debates got, they were all so essential to helping me understand, okay, what are we up against here? How are we going to move all of this forward in a practical way? I want to say that what I love about this model legislation is that it is absolutely based in a human rights framework without clobbering with human rights language and concepts in a way that could be debilitating for governments. And but at the same time, it is essential to note that its underpinnings are a human rights framework. And I think that's really important, because what the human rights framework gives us is something that we don't get without it, and we don't get with other frameworks. So I just want to highlight a couple of those things, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what I think governments can do with this, and different levels of government might do with this piece of model legislation. First of all, obviously, a human rights framework really understands that what needs to be resolved and remedied is always structural. It's not about the individual person and whether they have rats in their apartment and adequate heating, et cetera. That comes into play at some point, but that's not the heart of it. The heart of the matter is that there are some really big structural pieces that need to be addressed. And the framework recognizes that the best way to figure out what those structural barriers are is by going to the people themselves, and by having mechanisms built in where you actually hear from people about their experiences in housing. And this legislation incorporates that right at the end in a really meaningful and important way. And that's something that governments often forget, is how important it is to solve the problems. You have to listen to the people who are experiencing those structural barriers. The other thing that the legislation exposes about the human rights framework is that housing is not about the built structure, and the right to housing is not about the built structure. That's part of it. But look at all of the issues Porrick showed us are contained in this legislation. We have issues of homelessness and access to the built structure of housing. We have issues around the financialization of housing, going right into deep finance and financial issues and policy. Issues around migration and refugees are raised. And that's what makes this legislation pretty unique, because if we all go back to our own countries where we reside and look at housing legislation, most of us will find housing legislation is pretty much about the built structure. It very rarely will go into high finance, and even rarely go into migrants and refugees, for example, often cordoned off and siloed. The other thing I'll say is that the human rights framework forces us to provide timelines. So you'll see in the legislation, some things are absolutely immediate, some things can happen a little bit later. It also forces us to ensure that resources are spent in certain ways for human rights outcomes, also reflected in the legislation. And lastly, I'll say the human rights framework mandates and requires accountability and monitoring. And you'll see right at the end in section 10, implementation and enforcement, that section is hugely important, because that's where you get into the monitoring of governments, et cetera. And accountability and access to justice for people who are not enjoying what they should, excuse me, with respect to housing. Okay, so it's clearly based in a human rights framework. How is this going to be useful to governments? Could it be useful to governments? And I think it most definitely could be. First of all, I mean, of course, I would love it for governments at all levels to just go forth and adopt every single provision that's in here. That's not going to happen. I've worked with governments for far too long. That's not going to happen. But what could happen is that governments could do their own evaluation. Most governments at this point know that the housing crisis and the crisis of the virus or the pandemic have dovetailed. I don't see too many governments pretending that that's not the case. Most governments are admitting that they are really struggling with housing in the midst of this pandemic. And so one thing governments could simply do is weigh or mark themselves against the legislation. How are we doing here? Are there issues that we know are issues, but we don't know how to solve? Are there issues that we've completely ignored that are contained in here, like the issue of REITs, for example, real estate investment trusts, and the financialization of housing? Because I am seeing across the globe some activity on eviction moratoriums or some activity around homelessness, and I am seeing scant attention to what's going to happen around the financialization of housing. That is the gobbling up of distressed or devalued assets by big financial investors. So I think there's just that nice ability for governments to check in on themselves. Are we doing what we can? I think different orders of government can do that as well. So you're working at the local level, for example, and it's not your jurisdiction to do a lot of what's in here, but you could, as local government, use the model legislation to encourage different levels, different orders of government to do better and to do more in keeping with this legislation. And I think that there's a lot of power there, because I've noticed that cities are really scrambling, trying to figure out how they're going to deal with the housing crisis that's on their doorstep in the midst of this pandemic. And often they're saying to me, we don't have the competencies to do this. That's right. Often cities don't, but they could use this model legislation to lobby or advocate with other levels of government. I also think that this legislation should incentivize new legislation. Obviously, this was written in a generic, global friendly way. And so every jurisdiction is going to have their own ways of articulating things, their own particular issues. So while I, excuse me, don't recommend cherry picking, oh, we like this and not this, because that wouldn't be a human rights approach. This is a holistic piece of legislation. I do think there are some jurisdictions where they've already enacted some of the stuff that's in this model legislation, but they may want to borrow other pieces and say, hey, look, there is something we can do about financialization. It's in this section, and we can craft this to our own ends. I also wonder, and I think I might end with this idea, I wonder if there isn't the possibility for governments to bring this legislation to the people, for governments to set up conversations and discussions, to ask people, their constituents, whether it's a member of parliament, for example, could do this with their constituents, have a town hall through Zoom, very easy, to discuss what are the main housing barriers and challenges that constituents are experiencing, and how does this legislation speak to those experiences, and what more could government be doing? I think that's a hard sell. I think governments are afraid to open up cans of what they consider to be cans of worms. That being said, I think it provides such an interesting opportunity, because it really helps to delineate some of the key issues that I think people are really struggling, that I know people are struggling with around the world with respect to housing. Thanks so much. I'm going to leave my comments there.
Thank you, Leilani. And just to as well acknowledge how wonderful it was to have Leilani on the steering group, bringing with you such an incredible breadth of global knowledge and human rights knowledge, but doing it when you were already so incredibly busy. So really and truly, we felt very much, that was really appreciated, and is still appreciated, because you're still busy. So you've just said that you have to leave in probably about 20 minutes or so. So can I just invite people who are listening, if you have questions for Leilani, please put them in the chat now, and we'll try and come to them before you have to leave, if that's okay. So please, if you have specific questions for Leilani, put them in the chat now. And meanwhile, last but very definitely not least, I want to introduce Maria Aldanis, again, probably well known to most of you as the policy officer from Fianza, From 2014, she has coordinated the Housing First Europe Guide, an online training addressed to service providers. And then since 2016, she's been working on homelessness and housing rights issues with Fianza. She currently coordinates the Housing Rights Watch network and brings together NGOs, academics, lawyers, and others to promote access to housing rights for homeless people, support strategic litigation, and combat the criminalization of homelessness. Maria herself has studied law in Madrid and holds a master's degree in migration and intercultural relations. Maria is going to just outline for us how NGOs and advocacy groups can use this legislation. So handing over to you now, Maria.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'm really honored to participate in this webinar today with my distinguished colleagues in the panel. I have had the chance to work with all of them and learn a lot about advocacy on housing rights in Europe from them. First of all, I would like to say that Fianza, my federation, the European Federation, is based in Brussels. So one of our goals is also to lobby the EU to have homelessness in the agenda, homelessness and the right to housing. And this is a big part of the work that we do. And also about the Housing Rights Watch Network, which is a joint initiative between Fianza and Ave Pierre Foundation, created back in 2008. I would like to believe that we are somehow responsible for some of the developments on housing rights in Europe in the last decade. Before I start talking about how to use this tool, I would like to highlight that we have tried to disseminate information on the right to housing and using international and European human rights tools to advance housing rights in Europe and in the past. And the key goal has been supporting advocacy and litigation on the right to housing, and in particular through the collective complaint mechanism, but not only. So for us in Fianza and Housing Rights Watch, this comprehensive text is of great value. It really gathers in one single document human rights demands from different areas. And I think my colleagues have done a great job at explaining that, so I'm not going to go on about the content. But maybe when confronted with the model legislation, housing advocates and NGOs may have the feeling that it is somehow utopian, that it will be difficult to implement it all. Like, I totally agree with Leilani that it's a cohesive piece of legislation and it should be implemented as a whole. But it also feels like, in a way, overwhelming. Like, I would like to answer to that by saying that we may need to take one topic at a time, maybe take the one topic or several topics that really speak to you as a housing advocate and work on them. I'm sorry, Lani, but I'm probably going to suggest cherry picking this time. I'm sorry that I have to contradict you in some way. Maybe we can discuss that afterwards. As Fianza, well, the two main topics that we would have chosen, I mean, would be probably ending homelessness. I think slide 8 described, the slide 8 of that Porek described a bit what we have been doing during the pandemic, trying to advocate for immediate access to safe, secure, and dignified emergency accommodation throughout the pandemic, but also for those in emergency housing not to be evicted without alternative adequate accommodation, and finally to secure long-term housing with adequate support in the long run, not only during the pandemic, but afterwards. But also preventing rental evictions has become like a key issue for us because it's one of the main areas where homelessness is being created. A new flow of homelessness can come, let's say. So if I had to give some kind of suggestions to advocates, and I know that many of you are probably much more experts than we are in advocating for housing rights, I would say that you have to have some kind of a strategy, where you could outline your goals, identify the stakeholders that will be involved, and what activities you will do to reach them. Before anything, I would say that you will need to look at what pieces of the legislation at national level regulate this topic in your context, what section, what could be procedural law, rental tenancy law, analyze the legislation and how it has been implemented or not implemented at all, and what will be my demands in relation to the model legislation that we just discussed. So normally, a lot of the responsible bodies will be at state and regional level, but also, as Lilani mentioned, some of them are at local level. So for example, in principle, we want homeless people's rights to be respected at local level, even if they are sleeping rough. We want, for example, bylaws and ordinances to be respectful of their rights. And we want the city to provide shelter and long-term housing, also for all those sleeping rough. But sometimes it's not within their responsibilities to do that. They have some of the responsibility, but not all of them. So you need to target those who are responsible for that. And then you need to decide how you're going to convince that person or persons or service. So you need to find spaces to explain the relevance of our demands. This might require varied strategies, using creativity and persistence, mainly in most cases. So you might need several complementary initiatives to achieve the strategic goal. As an advocate, you will always need to find allies. And in Europe, I think we have several examples of a variety of NGOs, civil society organizations coming together in platforms to advocate for a change in legislation. I've just recently participated in a webinar in Spain where there's a monitoring group, a monitoring group that is following the ESCR committee's decision. I think this is a good example on how advocacy and local level can happen to change legislation. So once we know our legislation, what needs to be done, who to target, what allies we have, we need to use all tools at our disposal. And I think probably contacting political parties in parliament has been one of the main activities that groups have taken to convince them that the position is good, the benefits of the change. Obviously, using media to explain the demands and the reasons of the changes. Newspapers can be useful in denouncing the realities that are behind the laws or the lack of laws. Social media are key too. And obviously, I think among the participants today, using direct action methods, it's really relevant at the same time, you know. This week, I don't know if any one of you have mentioned that, but this week we celebrate in Europe something is called Housing Action Week. And there's, at least here in Brussels, there's a Housing Action Day on the 28th of March with many activities all over Europe. And of course, if all of these activities don't work, you can always find the strong cases, violation of on the right to housing that may lead to strategic litigation, which is another tool that we can all use. I think I'm going to leave it here. Maybe we can discuss these topics a bit more in the conversation. We do hope that this model legislation can help you take the work of housing advocates to another level. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for outlining a very much a step-by-step way in which advocacy groups can use this, and it reflects the extent of your own personal experience in doing this too. So really appreciate that. And I just want to, in case it doesn't come up at any other time, to really thank you for organizing this webinar. Nothing is too big a problem for Maria. No problem. So without your just the dedication and the very easy way in which you went about it, I'm not sure we'd have got off the ground in this particular part either. So just say thank you. Okay, so that's the end of our presentations as such, and it is really up to questions. So I'm aware, Liliana, you have to go. I did see in the chat an exchange. I don't know if you want to come back to any of it before you leave. It was to do with how local and municipal cities can incentivize governments. Is there anything additional you want to say in relation to that?
No, I mean, I think my note was clear enough. It was trying to chat and listen to Maria at the same time. So it was, hopefully it's clear enough. I mean, but really what I do tell cities is that they can't shirk their own responsibilities, and that in fact, they have a stronger argument if they say, look, we are doing everything we possibly can using all of our resources, all of our competencies to try to protect the right to housing or do a lot around housing. But so now we need you, national level government or even regional government, to step in and assist. And for cities to make it clear to other levels or orders of government that if a city doesn't meet their human rights obligations, that impugns the whole jurisdiction. It doesn't just impugn the city. So when the country is reviewed by the UN for their consistency and compliance with international human rights law, if a city is unable to meet their obligations, it impugns the entire country in the UN system. So I try to use those arguments. I'm not, Alicia, I'm not going to say that those arguments are successful. I'm just saying those are the ones I use. I do want to just pick up on what Maria Jose said about cherry picking. I actually agree with you. I mean, in a practical way, I mean, I will, if a jurisdiction is saying to me, well, we really care about homelessness, I'm not going to like, oh no, you have to care about all these other things. I'm going to work with them on homelessness. And I think that's the practical way. But I think it's always good to be constantly reminding that these things, and I think Fianza's work and the Shift's work is like this. These things are so integrated. Fianza may focus on homelessness. I may focus on financialization. But there's no way that we can disconnect those two worlds, for example. So just, it's that constant reminder, but recognizing, practically speaking, the cherry picking is going to happen. And okay, with that, I think I will slip away in just a couple minutes. I probably won't take the floor again. And I do want to thank Fianza for organizing this, Marguerite for pushing us, Porrick for doing such incredible work on this, and Cecilia, you were herding cats half the time.
Well, before you go and before we really get in, and while people are formulating your questions in the chat, I just wanted to come back to maybe invite us to share some of our own struggles as a collective in doing the in drawing together the legislation. Both yourself and Marguerite mentioned that we had heated discussions, and as one of the few people on the steering group, maybe the only one who hasn't got a legal background, I found those heated discussions really, really helpful, because they highlighted just exactly the challenge it is to translate human rights into legislation itself. And I just wonder, is there anything any of you would like to just recall from that? Because I think they are useful, they're educational, I just wonder if anything stands out that were things that we really had to struggle with in comprehensive legislation that is global, like, because it is ambitious. Anything come to mind that you want to share before we move on to questions? Or have I absolutely now put you all on the spot and you're going to never forgive me?
Oh, come on. One of the biggest heated debates we had was around criminal sanctions. and what to do, because of course the human rights framework is not a criminal law framework. So I was really struggling with criminal sanctions. Porrick was really clear, and I think Marguerite, you were clear too, that without the heavy hand of criminal sanctions, we've got nothing, like no enforcement. And I, of course, that resonated with me. So I'm putting that on the table now. You all can discuss.
Thank you. No, because it was great. I remember the discussion that was really, really good and really brought us to the core of, I suppose, pushing legislation and what it takes to push legislation and bed it down. Anything else that anyone wants to just recall? And we leave it at that then.
Well, yes, you're re-traumatizing us, Cecilia. I think the thing that really stood out to me that I got and learned from Leilani in that conversation was an awareness of the very different constituencies that this, or communities that this legislation impacts, and how the use of the police power, the validity of the use of the police, the desire to use the police power varies significantly based on, you know, where you are. If you're in a house that you own, you may feel very differently about calling the police or using the police, the power of the state, than if you're in an informal settlement or if you're homeless. So yeah, so that to me was my main takeaway from the discussion about using criminal sanctions.
Thanks, Marguerite. Anything?
I think we lost Leilani.
Leilani is going, yep. Anything you want to add, Porrick or Maria? And then we'll move on to questions.
Well, I think for me, what was very interesting, we were trying to create legislation that covered so many different countries. And, you know, it became clear as we were going through that different issues are important in different parts, especially in Northern Europe, you know, Central and Eastern Europe, and then Africa, you know, we were looking at even Canada and the US, that different issues are more important in different countries. Also, the approaches are different, as Marguerite just said. You know, whether you have criminal sanctions to support your housing rights is something we kind of assume as the norm here, but not everywhere. And, you know, it's a very delicate balance, how you introduce, you know, human rights law and then to have it enforced, whether you want to have it in state enforcement mechanism. Of course, that's the norm in terms of housing standards, where you do have criminal sanctions, where people breach public health standards, overcrowding, where illegal evictions, but it's not the norm in human rights language. And so we have quite a bit of work to do there, I think, to integrate what we'd probably call national housing law with international human rights law. There's a difference in approaches, but I think we've managed to do that, hopefully. And we've created this emergency housing tribunal, which is a sort of a bridge between national courts, if you like, and human rights monitoring organizations. We call it National Housing Tribunal, where people can make complaints and it can investigate complaints and it can apply sanctions. So that was something good that came out of our heated discussions, how we address these two things, these three things. And it's a model, perhaps, that might just be adopted. It also deals with the regional and national differences. So you can have regional tribunals and national courts, because this is an issue also that emerged. A lot of laws are created at regional level, especially in housing. And so even though you may have a national measure, the implementation actually happens at regional level or city level. And that was, for me, coming from a small country, that was quite a big surprise to have to think about, you know, in detail. They were the main things, but I mean, for me, the real benefit was having people from so many different backgrounds contributing and, you know, discussing how do we make these international human rights applicable and binding, you know, and workable at a national level. And that to me was really, it's a challenge, but I think we managed to overcome most of the questions. It'll be interesting to see if anybody tries to actually turn this into real legislation now in the next months or years. You know, what are the issues that come up? And I'd like to think we'll be there to see and learn from that.
Okay, Marguerite, you want to add?
Could I bring up another point of debate? I wouldn't say disagreement, but it goes to this cherry picking argument. One of the things that motivated me initially to work on this was the dream that different types of housing rights activists might actually work together in countries. And that was a discussion among the group as well. I think some people thought that I was a little naive thinking that was possible. I still think it's possible. How likely it is, I don't know. So I get, it goes to the cherry picking argument. Do you just work on this, the benefits for this group or that group? To me, in an ideal world, the activists for people in temporary settlements and migrant workers and people in rental housing and people in mortgage housing would all work together. Again, that might be utopian as well, but that was, just so that that was one of the things that motivated me to get into this. So.
Okay, I'm going to start to try and address some of the questions that have been coming through. So hopefully between Ellie and myself and everybody else, we'll pick up most of them. So there were a few very early questions around specific groupings. So maybe I'll just start with them because they came in first of all. There was a question around how does the 30% cap take into consideration the increasing and accruing debt like student loans. That arose during your presentation, Pádraig. I don't know if you want to say anything in relation to that.
Just ask you to unmute, Pádraig.
Okay. Yes. No, that wasn't. We hadn't considered issues of student loans. We hadn't considered in great detail the issue of students not being able to take up their accommodation. It hadn't been one of the issues that we had considered actually in any great detail. But the rule still applies, though, that the housing costs should not be more than 30% of the costs of the household, including any arrears. Now, loans for accommodation or loans for study would be slightly different. So, but we hadn't considered them, is the answer.
Okay, and maybe just related to that, there were at least two comments coming through about travellers needing to be named as a specific grouping, and an acknowledgement that both within France and Ireland that they can easily not get named. So I just wonder if anyone would like to just address that or respond to that comment. For myself, just to maybe just say that this steering group and producing this legislation happened within a very tight time frame, because nobody knew how long we were going to be talking about this, and there was a real urgency to get this together as quickly as possible. So I think we would all acknowledge that not everything is covered by any means, but just would anyone else like to say anything to respond to that comment?
Do you want to, Pádraig, or should I?
Yeah, there is a section on protection from eviction, which really covers, a whole range of people. It covers all their issues, including informal settlements or encampments. That's section 1. No forced evictions during the pandemic and for the period afterwards until it's finished. So it is actually there in section 1.
Marguerite, did you want to add anything?
No, I was going to say the same thing. And obviously in different countries, different terminology is used. Travelers is used in some places, in other places these provisions might apply to refugees or might apply to Roma. So temporary settlements and informal settlements, I think, is the terminology we use.
Okay, there was a bit of an exchange as well, I saw, in relation to people in social housing and exchange of what happens in Flanders, and see Georgiana Ipur is in the audience somewhere, so replying in relation to what happens in Romania, and a question about how can you get governments to increase the supply of housing. Anyone got anything that you'd like to say in relation to those questions, or is it just enough to acknowledge the comments?
I just wanted to answer from the perspective of Fianza. Obviously, social housing is an essential solution to house the most vulnerable groups, including the homeless. And there's been a trend in Europe over the few decades, maybe 2 decades, of reduced social housing. I think that for most of the actors that we've been working in this area in these last decades, we just acknowledged that social housing was reducing and tried to find other ways of housing. So I think that was one of our reactions, like being practical and pragmatic about it, and finding other ways of finding accommodation for vulnerable groups. And that's why I wanted to mention a very small initiative that we have, the Housing Solutions Platform. So the idea was to find innovative solutions for affordable housing in Europe, which is not social housing most of the time. But of course, I think that maybe with all the money that is going with the different recovery plans and so on, I think there's a possibility that more social housing will be done within Europe. I guess that there's a possibility and a chance and an opportunity, but I don't know if governments will take it. So maybe just to say that. And of course, like the consequence of not having social housing and relying solely on private rented housing and the affordability crisis that we were suffering before the pandemic arrived. That's something that needs to be tackled. Like it's hasn't been solved. Like so, it's a huge issue.
Yeah. And so too is one of the other questions that have just come in on top of that, which is how do you get governments to look at housing that is based on needs, not on available funding? That's another one of those challenges that have been with us for forever, it seems. Any additional comments anyone would like to make on them? Okay, I'm going to just move on to some of the other questions. Like one, is there an example of countries that have applied some of the legislation? Was a question that came in, and both Marguerite and Pádraig, you were very clear when we started this whole process that there was legislation in place in countries that reflected some of what's in the model legislation. Would either of you like to just identify or say a bit about some of the legislation that you looked at that made us think that maybe this isn't so as impossible as it seems?
Just ask you to unmute again, Pádraig.
Yes, well, alongside this piece of legislation, there was a very detailed report carried out by Georgiana. I see you're there on the list. A great piece of research looking around the world at what measures had been introduced between March and July 2020. And this revealed really an interesting mix of legislation where we found quite a lot of countries had imposed an eviction moratorium on rented housing, sometimes even on mortgaged housing, sometimes in all areas of housing, including Ireland. And this was really a big surprise. And the report is available on the link. I'm sure we can send the link here. It's a really detailed report, but it shows that there was a whole range of measures, including forgiveness on mortgage arrears, including rent freeze. Rent freezes were very, very common. There was also extension of the duration of a lease in some countries, where even if the lease was due to end, it was extended on until July initially, in some cases January this year, and now in some cases to July this year. And one of the countries that impressed me the most was the United States, which I hadn't expected to have such powerful restrictions on evictions from rented housing. They even had an income limit to which would apply up to quite a high level of income. And it also had sanctions against landlords who carried out illegal evictions. So there's quite a lot of precedents, if you like, around the world that we looked at. The OECD have done a report, again, looking at all of the countries in the OECD. And again, they've come up with a table around the world. Quite a lot of countries have eviction moratoria, rent freeze, mortgage, moratoria on mortgage repossessions, which is also very interesting. And some of them have other measures on top of that, which is emergency accommodation for homeless people in hotels. Quite a lot of countries have done that. What's interesting about the justifications for that, the one that I was most surprised at was the American one from the CDC. And their justification was that if we make people homeless, they're going to congregate in places wherever they can effectively, and we won't have any control over the spread of the virus. And I thought it was a very interesting justification for preventing evictions. You know, it's quite original in my view, but very effective. Now, the big question, of course, is how do we turn these temporary measures into long-term right to housing legislative measures? And of course, this is what we saw. This is a really good opportunity. We've got the legislative framework in place in a lot of countries. What we need to do is build on it and use it to promote the right to housing.
Marguerite, do you want to add anything?
I wanted to add that although we did see some really interesting provisions and approaches, we also saw lots of evidence that these were being completely ignored, that people were still being evicted. And in the US, there were numerous cases of state judges, local judges, completely ignoring the CDC regulations. That was federal law. It had nothing to do with landlord-tenant stuff, which is why, again, we spent a lot of time and put a lot into this legislation about enforcement and monitoring. That's why that is so critical. It's not enough to simply get the provision into the law. It's just not enough. And now I forgot my second point. That's what happens. So I have more than one point. But that was my main. There's some really interesting stuff out there, and Georgiana's report, which I think you have a site to now, can direct you towards some specifics. But it's not sufficient to simply have this in the law if it's not enforceable. Oh, and the other part of this, I think that really affected our approach was that even when in states that banned evictions, they didn't ban necessarily eviction proceedings. So landlords could still go ahead and take tenants to court for eviction proceedings, which of course, people were getting notices that they had, many evictions are not resolved in court. People simply get their eviction notice and they leave. So for that reason, it was very important to us to include provisions that said that you could not even start an eviction proceeding or move forward on an existing eviction proceeding, because people were falling through the cracks, even in states that had pretty good legislation because of those 2 points.
Okay. Ali, have I missed questions that you've spotted? Because I'm doing my best here.
No, I think that's great. We started with the early ones and then have followed on. Yeah, I think that's good. Were you looking for any more, Cecilia?
Well, yeah, I am. I'm putting out another call for questions. So if you have other things in your mind, please feel free to ask them. In the meantime, I think I just wondered, and again, I'm sorry, I'll be looking for forgiveness after this webinar, but I'm going to put Pádraig on the spot. Pádraig, you were involved in writing and advocating for housing legislation very successfully in Ireland. And I just wonder, is there any learning or insights that you've had from that experience that might be useful now to people in this audience as they consider applying it? Anything that strikes you from that experience?
Yes, well, it was one of the things we discovered is to have allies, but the other thing is to be specific. I know, Marguerite, we had lots of discussions about that as well. Legislators like things to be specific. You know, if you're proposing legislation, it's got to be very specific. And we discovered that when we produced the legislation on the proportionality assessments in Irish mortgage proceedings, which is now part of the Irish law, that yes, we came in initially with a whole lot of documents from international human rights to say, yes, courts should consider this, should consider this, should consider this. And then through our discussions with the drafters, there's a whole group of people known as legislative drafters, they were able to say, well, you need to narrow this down to make it really specific so that there's no ambiguity. And so that's the secret of it, really. So there's the least possible ambiguity in your language. And also not to try to do everything in one piece of legislation. That was, I think, the biggest lesson we learned. You have to, you know, be realistic and say, if we can get one piece of legislation through and it's going to be effective and binding, it's better than having 100 pieces of legislation which never get approved because they don't ever have any effect. So if you can incrementally build on what's existing step by step towards the right to housing and legislation, that's really the best advice I can give to anybody, is build on what's there, find the allies who have promoted what's existing. So if you can find the people who already were involved in the COVID legislation, you've immediately got a set of allies who are aware of what you're talking about. And so you can build on that and not to be too unrealistic. So we've tried in this draft model legislation here to be realistic. There's also another word called measurable, so that you have to be able to measure whether this legislation is actually being implemented or not. Because you can have a wonderful piece of symbolic legislation. So I would say the two words to remember are symbolic and instrumental. And you want to be instrumental. You can have a symbolic declaration. It will be great and it will look great and it will be very media friendly. But in terms of benefiting people, you've got to be really instrumental. So you've got to be specific and measurable about what you do. But I would say there's lots of people who want to bring in legislation. Probably it's good to talk to people who have been through the process. I mean, politicians are experts at this. You know, they know how to do it. And they are the people who build alliances, advocates as well, advocates and NGOs. But the secret is building alliances and being specific.
Thanks, Pádraig. I see we have a question come in, which is maybe, I'm not sure there's an answer to, in relation to the rental market and where people own maybe 2 or 3 units, and the whole question of how can people survive if tenants don't pay their rents? How can they pay for the cost of these units? These are some of the really tricky challenges, I suppose, that we're facing. And I just wonder, does anyone want to comment on that? I'm not sure there's an answer to it, but would anyone like to comment?
We did address this in the legislation, and I'm smiling because I think it was Pádraig. I don't know who brought this in, but there is a provision there that suggests that there is a provision that where funds are available, small landlords who own, I think, is it less than 10?
Less than 10.
Less than 10 properties should be able to access funds, any kind of COVID recovery funds that are available. And I'm smiling because when this came up, I was skeptical. I was like, no, why are you putting this in? This was another area where there was some contention. I was like, they can take care of themselves. And so we definitely have a provision in there on that because of this very concern that you raised in the chat. Pádraig, do you want to add?
Mute.
Ask you to unmute. Yeah.
Yes, some interesting things came up in our discussion, especially around informal settlements in Asia, Africa. South America. That, you know, when we see informal settlements and we talk about the right to housing, you have to also consider that there's a whole dynamic taking place within these informal settlements, where some people actually arrange the accommodation for other people in the informal settlements. Now, we'd probably call them landlords in our word in Europe. They wouldn't necessarily be seen as landlords. They'd be more or less seen as, you know, people who organize the places for those in the informal settlements to live. So there's kind of structures that exist which allow, you know, rented properties to become available, not even rented, but informally rented. No rental contract. And, you know, sometimes these people rely on a small payment from the occupants for the system to work. Now, we could say, well, that's exploitation, that's rents. But when we talk to the people from the South African Human Rights Commission, they said, no, you must make sure that you don't dismantle that arrangement, because otherwise you could have complete instability and homelessness. It actually has a function. And so that's what made us think a bit about the small landlords, that if your small landlords are put out of business and if their properties are repossessed, then what happens, like what happens in Ireland, is the tenants become homeless. So you have to have some recognition that there are structures in place. For sometimes small landlords we have in Ireland, sometimes we're called reluctant landlords, who bought properties at the top of the market, who are in negative equity, who can't sell the properties. And at the same time, if the property is repossessed, then we have a family becoming homeless. So that's the reason we're not advocating a whole new regime of supporting landlords. We're talking about this, in this case, where it prevents homelessness and where the funds are being made available or are available, that they should focus on small landlords and not corporate landlords.
Okay, I just want to thank Ali has drawn my attention to some of the questions I may have omitted. So there is one from that list, Ali, thank you, which is, what are some of the common patterns you've seen across the globe? That was it was quite interesting being in such a global conversation. Anything come to mind about common patterns that surfaced? As we rack our brains, this is like an exam, you know, in legislation and in memory.
I think we've already said something about trends, like the trend, like social housing, like not investment in social housing, but more in private in allocations and housing allocations, housing benefits and things like that. More rented housing being used, at least in Europe. I mean, I don't know about the globe. This is more a European conversation. I don't know. Maybe we could discuss Airbnb.
But there was a lot of conversation about financialization, as I recall it, and probably Porrick, your best place to talk about that. But that certainly was something that was common across the globe. Would you like to?
That's common. I think you can go ahead, Porrick.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the things that came out really is the similarities of, okay, we all think every country is different, which it is, but the similarities that have been created across the world through COVID have really opened up a window of looking at things which we never had before, because we all have a common language of dealing with a common emergency. And states have had to respond to very much the same kind of things. You know, health, public health, people being told to stay in their homes. So the value of home has just become enormously significant for governments, that people need their homes to live in order to protect them from the pandemic. And that's a really, if you like, you know, that's a real shift in the conversation. It's a remarkable shift in the conversation, that the focus now of government policy is people in their homes and keeping people in their homes. This is something that we've been saying for a long time as a way of counteracting evictions, that you need to have legislation to keep people in their homes. Now we have legislation in most countries to keep people in their homes, to protect them in their homes. And so what struck me is we've got global common language for the first time, where everybody understands the same issues and everybody's dealing with the same issues to try and protect people from the pandemic and trying to keep people in their homes, even work from their homes, but to stay in their homes. So that was, I hate to use the word, and Marguerite said, you know, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, but it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity where we have a common language everywhere in the world called COVID. Now, unfortunately, it's not a good language. It's not a good starting point, but it is a common focus, and it's around home, and it's around people being at home and staying at home. So that's where I think our inspiration came to say, this is a good time to create legislation. Everybody will understand what we're trying to do. And that has been always a problem because, as Leilani has said, we have lots of these little silos where we talk about asylum seekers, we talk about homelessness, we talk about financialization. Another group of people talk about mortgage possessions, you know, but now all these things are all connected. They're all the same.
Okay, Marguerite, yes?
I hate to bring us down from Park's positive note, but one of the really discouraging trends that stood out in my mind was, and this was happening in Europe and all over the world, it was that COVID and public health, public safety was being used as an excuse to forcibly evict people from informal settlements and temporary settlements. And of course, it was just a pretext, because if you really want to keep a community safe, you help people stay where they are and help them stay safe. You don't make them homeless by destroying their settlement. But it's just a disturbing trend, I think, and an example of how, you know, there are always other forces that will use a crisis as an opportunity to forward their own goals. And it's just something to be aware of, that the COVID's been used to divide people as well on the issue of housing.
Okay, thank you. There are two more questions up in the chat, and I think we'll use them as the last two questions before we do a final word. So I'll just take the two of them together, and whoever wants to jump in, please do so. One is, how do you see developers being involved in solving the problem? And the other is about housing policies making a huge difference. So how do you see governments moving to adopt better planning? So if anyone wants to deal with either of those, and then I think we'll hand over for a final word. Small issues.
Well, I mean, I suppose we wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. So we're creating this draft legislation, and we wanted to include in it, you know, some of the best practices that we see around the world, including using the planning system to gain social housing planning gain. So that what we're saying is that if there's any assistance whatsoever being provided to developers of housing, this is private developers of housing, that there has to be a condition that a proportion of what's built will be social housing, dependent on local needs. So obviously, if there's no need, this condition wouldn't apply, but that won't apply in most of the cities in the world. So that for those cities that don't have this provision, we want to, I suppose, you know, promote, be a catalyst for people to say, yes, you need to put this kind of condition into your legislation. So any private developments that take place have a percentage of social housing. In London, it's 50%. In Ireland, it's 10%, now about to become 20%. So in New York, it varies, I know, as well. And so lots of cities have it, lots of cities don't have it. We were just promoting it.
Okay, I think at this point, we probably should think of just having a final word from all of you before we bring the session to a close. So maybe I'll start with where we began. No, we'll start where we ended. I'll start with you, Maria, first. Is there anything you'd like to say by way of closure? Just anything that's striking you or whatever?
From the perspective of Fianza, I think the pandemic was more an opportunity than anything else, like to really end homelessness. I mean, there's a chance, there's the opportunity to change things, something that we didn't see before. And we just hope that this opportunity will lead into a better world and the things keep improving. So yeah, that's the only thing I would like to say.
Thank you, Maria. Boric?
Yeah, I just want to say it's been a great experience drafting this, and we all had different approaches to it. And we've created something I think is going to be useful. It's going to be available online. It's going to be available there for anybody who wants to download it. Please promote it.
Thank you. Marguerite?
Yeah, I just want to second what's already been said. And the legislation is up. It is available. It's also available in Spanish and French on the website. We would welcome your suggestions on, how to promote it, how to publicize it, any ideas that you have. We also hope you'll stay in touch. If you do end up making some progress in your various countries, we'd love to know about it. And thank you for your interest in this.
Okay, I'm going to leave the last word to Ali. So for me, I just want to say thank you very much for all of you for participating so actively as well, and putting the panel through its paces, both in terms of remembering everything that was in it and just coming up and responding. It was a great exchange. The whole experience has been a great learning experience. And I think we build this as a capacity building seminar, but in fact, it is a capacity building seminar between all of us, because we're all learning how do you take legislation around human rights to the next level. So this is very much a shared learning experience. So thank you once again. And thanks particularly to Maria for making this possible and for taking the lead on it. Really appreciate it. And I've already thanked Marguerite and Pádraig, and I just want to thank Ali for coming in at the last minute and certainly helping me with the technical realities of our world, because I certainly wouldn't have been able to manage it on my own. So thank you. And Ali, if there's a final word you'd like to say.
Yeah, so no problem. Thanks so much, Cecilia, and to all of our enlightening team, and just say goodbye to everyone. And I think we'll be sending out a follow-up just with details of where to find the recording. And I know there was questions about who was here, and unfortunately the webinar is a bit hard for you to see that, but we'll certainly try and share whatever follow-up we can. And so just to say goodbye and thank you to you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
See you soon in real life.
Hopefully.